Spinoza begins from the foundation of reality itself. For him, everything that exists is contained within one infinite substance. This substance is not created, not contingent, not dependent on anything else. It exists in itself through itself and cannot be conceived through anything other than itself. All other things, what we call finite beings, objects, people, stars, animals, thoughts, and bodies, are only modes, modifications of this infinite substance. This substance is what Spinoza calls God. But unlike the personal deity of organized religion, Spinoza's God is not anthropomorphic, not a being with a will, passions, or moral commands. God is identical, nature itself. Deus sive natura, God or nature. It is the same reality under two names. What religion calls divine creation is simply the unfolding of necessary natural order. What religion calls miracles are only events misunderstood because everything in nature follows from eternal and immutable laws. This God has infinite attributes, but humans know only two: thought and extension. Thought corresponds to the realm of ideas, mind, and consciousness. Extension corresponds to the realm of bodies, matter, and physical space. For every mode of extension, there is a parallel mode of thought. Mind and body are not two separate substances but two ways of describing the same reality. This is Spinoza's doctrine of parallelism. In this system, dualism collapses. Cartesian philosophy posited two distinct substances: residential cogitans, thinking substance, and residential extensor, extended substance. But Spinoza rejects this. If there were two substances, they would have to be completely independent. Yet our experience shows that thought and extension are not independent but correspond to each other. Thus, both are attributes of the same substance. This substance is absolutely infinite. It encompasses everything. It cannot be caused by anything outside itself, for there is nothing outside it. It is eternal, for existence belongs to its essence. To imagine God as creating the world out of nothing is to impose human metaphors on divine necessity. Creation is not a temporal event but an eternal expression of the substance's power. From this perspective, freedom takes on a new meaning. God, or nature, acts from the necessity of its own nature. It cannot act otherwise than it does. Likewise, everything follows necessarily from this substance. The order of nature is not contingent. Nothing could have been otherwise than it is. Every event, from the falling of a leaf to the rise of an empire, follows with the same necessity as the properties of a triangle follow from its definition. This leads to the doctrine of determinism. Spinoza denies free will in the ordinary sense. Human beings think they are free because they are conscious of their desires and actions, but they are ignorant of the causes that determine. Just as a stone thrown through the air would think it moves freely if it were conscious, so do humans believe themselves free while being moved by causes beyond their control. True freedom, then, cannot mean the ability to do otherwise. It must mean understanding the necessity of nature and aligning oneself with it. Knowledge of God or nature is not speculative but practical. To understand the necessity of things is to cease lamenting that they are otherwise. It is to accept reality with equanimity. Spinoza calls this intellectual love of God. It is not a love directed toward a person but a rational joy in recognizing oneself as a mode of the infinite substance. This intellectual love is eternal for the mind, insofar as it understands things sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, participates in eternity itself. Thus, the metaphysical foundation leads directly into ethics. Human beings are finite modes of the infinite substance. Each of us is an expression of God's attributes under the forms of thought and extension. The human body is a complex mode of extension. The human mind is the corresponding mode of thought. At the core of human nature is conatus, the striving of each thing to persist in its being. Everything, whether stone, plant, animal, or human, strives to continue existing and to increase its power of acting. For humans, this striving is expressed as desire. Desire is the very essence of man. From it flow the passions, the emotions that move us in joy or sadness, love or hate, hope or fear. The passions, however, are not free. They are passive states, arising from external causes that affect us. To be in the grip of passion is to be at the mercy of external forces. To act from reason is to be active, to express one's essence adequately. The ethical task is to move from passivity to activity, from being determined by external causes to acting from the necessity of one's own nature understood through reason. Spinoza analyzes the emotions geometrically, deducing their relations as if they were properties of lines and figures. Joy is the passage to greater perfection, sadness to lesser perfection. Love is joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Hate is sadness accompanied by such an idea. Hope is an unstable joy arising the imagination of a future good. Fear is an unstable sadness from imagining a future evil. By clarifying the nature of emotions, reason enables us to gain mastery over them. Yet mastery does not mean suppression. Spinoza does not preach asceticism or denial of the passions. Instead, he shows how understanding transforms. For example, hatred diminishes when we understand its causes and see the person who wronged us as determined by necessity. Compassion becomes active when guided by reason, leading us to seek the well-being of others not out of pity but from recognition of our shared nature. The highest virtue is the pursuit of understanding, which enhances our power of acting. This virtue is identical with happiness, for happiness is not the reward of virtue but virtue itself. To live according to reason is to live in joy, in harmony harmony with the necessity of nature. Spinoza distinguishes three kinds of knowledge. The first is imagination, which arises from sensory experience and opinion. It is fragmentary, confused, subject to error. Most of human life is lived at this level. We form inadequate ideas, shaped by chance encounters and external impressions. From this arise superstition, prejudice, and the illusions of free will. The second is reason, which proceeds through common notions and adequate ideas. Reason grasps things through their necessary connections. It understands universal principles, such as the laws of motion or the geometrical properties of figures. It leads to freedom, for through reason we see things not as contingent but as necessary. The third and highest is intuitive knowledge. This is a direct perception of things in their essence, under the aspect of eternity. It is not discursive reasoning but an immediate intellectual vision. Through this knowledge, the mind sees itself and the world as modes of the infinite substance. This intuitive knowledge gives rise to the intellectual love of God, the highest blessedness. Error arises only from inadequate ideas. Inadequate ideas are partial, confused, representing things as contingent and disconnected. Adequate ideas are clear, distinct, and necessary. To increase knowledge is to move from inadequate to adequate ideas, from imagination to reason, and ultimately to intuition. This epistemology is inseparable from ethics. The more we understand, the less we are enslaved by passions. Ignorance breeds fear and superstition, which lead to servitude. Knowledge brings joy, freedom, and peace of mind. Spinoza's ethics is unlike any other philosophical work, structured not as an essay but as a geometrical demonstration. It is composed of definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, and corollaries. This is not a stylistic flourish but a deliberate strategy. By presenting human life geometric order, Spinoza aims to show that morality, psychology, and theology follow the same necessity as mathematics. Ethics, therefore, is not a matter of divine command or cultural convention. It is a science of human nature. Just as geometry reveals the properties of space regardless of opinion, so ethics reveals the laws of human flourishing regardless of prejudice. This is why Spinoza says that good and evil are not intrinsic qualities but modes of thought relative to our striving for existence. What is good is what increases our power of acting. What is evil is what diminishes it. This definition breaks radically with traditional morality. For Spinoza, there is no transcendent standard of right and wrong imposed by God. Instead, morality is immanent to human nature. Joy is good because it enhances our conatus. Sadness is bad because it reduces it. Virtue is power. To be virtuous is to live in accordance with reason, thereby increasing our capacity to exist and act. Yet, virtue is not selfishness. Because humans are social beings, our flourishing is bound up with the flourishing of others. To seek the good rationally is to seek harmony and cooperation. Reason teaches that nothing is more useful to man than man. Therefore, the highest good is the pursuit of understanding in a community of free individuals. Ethics, then, is inseparable from politics. Just as the individual must master passions by reason, so the community must order itself by rational laws. Politics is the collective ethics of humanity. Freedom in Spinoza's sense is one of the most misunderstood parts of his philosophy. To the common view, freedom means contingency, the ability to choose otherwise, to break away from necessity. But Spinoza argues that this is an illusion. Everything, including human actions, follows from the necessity of the divine nature. Nothing could have been otherwise. If freedom is not contingency, then what is it? Freedom is understanding necessity. A free man is one who acts from the necessity of his own nature, not from external compulsion. When guided by reason, we act rather than being acted upon. We express our essence instead of being determined by alien forces. Imagine a child who desires sweets. If he acts on impulse, he is determined by external objects, the sugary taste, the fleeting pleasure. If he understands health and acts according to reason, he is guided by his own essence. This is true freedom, not doing whatever one desires in the moment, but acting from the clarity of reason in harmony with necessity. This redefinition of freedom transforms ethics. Instead of lamenting that things are not otherwise, we learn to accept them with equanimity. Instead of blaming fortune or divine, we seek understanding. The wise man, Spinoza says, is scarcely troubled in spirit. He does not envy, hate, or scorn. He strives to understand, and in understanding finds peace. This freedom culminates in the intellectual love of God. To understand the necessity of all things is to love God not with fear or hope but with joy. This love is eternal because it does not depend on perishable objects but on the eternal substance itself. Spinoza's political philosophy extends directly from his metaphysics and ethics. Just as individuals strive to persist in their being, so do communities. The state is not an artificial contract imposed on individuals but the natural outcome of humans striving for security and cooperation. Humans, left to the sway of passions, are led by envy, hatred, and violence. Reason teaches that life is safer and more flourishing in society than in isolation. Therefore, individuals transfer some of their natural power to the state, which embodies the collective power of the people. This is not a surrender of rights but a transformation of right. For Spinoza, is identical with power. The state has the right to rule only insofar as it has the power to do so. Unlike Hobbes, who emphasized the absolute authority of the sovereign, Spinoza leans toward democracy. For him, democracy best embodies guarantees the natural equality of human beings. All men are by nature equal, for all are modes of the same substance. In a democracy, individuals retain their power by participating in the collective decision-making. The purpose of the state is not to dominate, but to enable individuals to live securely and rationally. The end of politics is freedom, not slavery. True freedom, however, does not mean license to act without restraint. It means living according to reason within a community governed by rational laws. Spinoza also emphasizes freedom of thought. No state can control the inner life of its citizens. Belief cannot be coerced. Attempts to suppress free thought lead to hypocrisy, rebellion, and instability. A stable state allows freedom of philosophy, for truth does not threaten authority but strengthens it. This defense of free thought anticipates modern liberalism. Spinoza insists that religion and philosophy must be distinguished. The role of religion is to encourage obedience and charity through simple moral teachings, but philosophy must pursue truth without restriction. The state must guarantee this freedom, for without it, progress and peace are impossible. Spinoza lived in a time when religion dominated public and private life. His ideas were so radical that he was excommunicated from the Jewish community in Amsterdam. His theological political treatise was condemned by both church and state. Yet his critique of religion is central to his philosophy. For Spinoza, scripture is not a source of metaphysical truth but a historical document. It was written by prophets in particular times and places, using the language and imagination of their cultures. Its purpose is moral, not theoretical. The prophets did not aim to teach philosophy but to inspire obedience, charity, and justice. Therefore, scripture must be interpreted critically. Like any other text, miracles are not violations of natural laws but events whose causes were not understood. To attribute them to divine intervention is superstition. True piety is not blind obedience to dogma but love of God expressed in justice and charity toward others. Spinoza's identification of God with nature dissolves the conflict between faith and reason. What religion calls divine will is nothing but the order of nature. To know God is not to submit to revelation but to understand the world rationally. Philosophy is the highest form of worship. Superstition, by contrast, arises from fear and ignorance. When people lack knowledge, they attribute events to the whims of the divine. They pray for miracles, fear divine punishment, and cling to rituals. Rulers exploit this fear to maintain power. Against this, Spinoza champions reason, freedom, and the intellectual love of God. Spinoza's analysis of the passions is not only individual but social. In society, passions are amplified and reinforced. Ambition, envy, resentment, and pride often dominate collective life. Crowds are swayed by emotions more than by reason, which is why demagogues and priests can manipulate them. Fear is the strongest instrument of control. Religion often relies on fear of hell, punishment, and divine wrath. Politics often relies on fear of enemies, conspiracies, and disorder. Spinoza unmasks these mechanisms of control, showing that they keep people enslaved. Yet reason has the power to liberate. By cultivating understanding, individuals can resist manipulation. By organizing into democratic institutions, societies can mitigate the destructive force of passions. The goal is not to eliminate passions but to transform them through knowledge. For example, love guided by reason becomes benevolence. Ambition guided by reason becomes the pursuit of excellence. This is why education and philosophy are essential to politics. A free state must promote rational understanding among its citizens, encouraging them to act from reason rather than fear. Only then can peace and stability endure. The central problem in human life, according to Spinoza, is bondage to the passions. We are tossed about like waves in the ocean, moved by causes beyond our control, deceived by imagination, and chained to external objects. A person believes himself free when he follows his desires, yet he is in fact enslaved to them, for he does not grasp their causes. To be free requires not rejecting passion but understanding. Spinoza's innovation is that he does not propose to overcome the passions by force of will. That, he says, is impossible, for emotions cannot be eliminated by commands. The only thing that can conquer a passion is a stronger, contrary passion born of adequate knowledge. For example, fear of death can dominate life, but understanding the eternal nature of the mind transforms fear into intellectual joy. Hatred of others can corrode the soul, but understanding that every person acts from necessity softens hatred and turns it into compassion. Consider anger. If someone insults me, my first reaction is sadness linked with the idea of an external cause. This is hatred. I may desire revenge, imagining it will bring relief. Yet reason shows me that the offender acted from causes beyond his control, perhaps ignorance, fear, envy, or misguided passion. Seeing this necessity weakens hatred. My understanding itself becomes a passion, an active joy, because my mind now affirms its power by perceiving truth. Thus, understanding transforms my emotional landscape. This is the secret of Spinoza's ethical psychology. Emotions are not enemies but raw energies that can be redirected. Sadness can become joy if we change our perspective. Hope can become confidence if grounded in reason. Love, when guided by knowledge, becomes the intellectual love of God. Even fear can be transformed, for recognizing necessity dissolves fear's foundation in uncertainty. Through this transformation, the human mind gradually becomes free. Not free in the sense of being independent from causality, but free in the sense of acting from its own nature understood clearly. The mind that sees the world sub-species eternitatis eternitatis no longer laments what cannot be changed, nor exalts itself for contingent success. It rejoices in understanding, and this joy is the highest virtue. This ethical path has profound implications for society. If individuals can transform passions into understanding, then collective life too can be guided by reason rather than superstition. Wars, persecutions, and hatreds all arise from fear, ignorance, and ambition. If citizens were educated to understand necessity, to accept diversity, and to live by reason, then peace would be possible. Spinoza's ethics thus becomes a political program as much as a personal discipline. One of the most enigmatic yet profound aspects of Spinoza's philosophy is his doctrine of the eternity of the mind. On the surface, Spinoza rejects the immortality of the soul as traditionally understood. He denies that there is a personal afterlife where rewards and punishments are distributed. Instead, he offers a radical redefinition of eternity. The human mind, insofar as it is the idea of the body, perishes when the body perishes. However, insofar as the mind participates in adequate ideas, it partakes in eternity. Eternity, for Spinoza, is not endless duration in time but existence outside time. To see things sub specie eternitatis is to see them not as past or future but as necessary expressions of infinite substance. When the mind understands things through the third kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge, it participates in God's infinite intellect. These ideas are eternal, and the mind, insofar as it has them, is eternal too. This is not personal survival but intellectual participation. The more the mind understands, the greater its share in eternity. Thus, the wise person does not fear death. His highest joy is already eternal. He experiences blessedness here and now, in the intellectual love of God. Death is not a loss, because what is eternal in the mind cannot be destroyed. This conception replaces the hope of an afterlife with the certainty of present eternity. This doctrine also reshapes ethics. Instead of acting from fear of punishment or hope of reward, the wise man acts from love of truth. Instead of postponing happiness to another world, he realizes blessedness in this life. Philosophy becomes a spiritual practice, teaching how to live joyfully in the face of necessity. Compare this with religious doctrines that promise heaven or threaten hell. Spinoza sees such doctrines as instruments of control, designed to manipulate passions. By contrast, his doctrine liberates the mind. It shifts attention from imaginary futures to the eternal present. It transforms fear into love, servitude into freedom, superstition into understanding. The eternity of the mind thus completes the ethical system. From substance to conatus, from passions to reason, from knowledge to blessedness, the entire path converges in this vision of eternity. To live well is to live eternally, not after death, but now, in the clarity of intellectual love. Spinoza's denial of free will shocked his contemporaries and remains one of his most controversial positions. He insists that will is nothing apart from particular volitions, and these volitions are determined by causes extending infinitely back. To say that the will is free is like saying a stone, conscious of its motion, believes it moves by choice. People resist this conclusion because they confuse consciousness of action with knowledge of its causes. When I decide to raise my hand, I am aware of my action, but not of the chain of causes that led to it, my biology, upbringing, desires, and the laws of nature. This ignorance produces the illusion of freedom. Critics argue that determinism destroys morality. If everything is necessary, how can we be responsible? Spinoza responds that responsibility does not depend on contingency but on understanding. When we act from reason, we express our true nature and are therefore free. When we are driven by passions, we are enslaved. Responsibility is thus internal to freedom, not opposed to it. This perspective dissolves guilt and blame. Instead of condemning people as absolute evil, we see them as products of necessity. A criminal is not free in the sense of being uncaused. He acts from inadequate ideas and passions. The appropriate response is not vengeance but understanding and correction. Justice becomes a matter of education and rehabilitation, not retribution. Moreover, determinism enriches ethics. If all things follow from necessity, then nothing is truly tragic. We may experience loss, pain, or disappointment, but we understand that these are necessary consequences of nature. By shifting our perspective, we can accept them with equanimity. In this way, determinism becomes a source of peace. Finally, determinism elevates science. By rejecting chance and contingency, Spinoza affirms that everything can be understood through laws. This underpins the scientific worldview, where nature is not a realm of miracles but of order. Philosophy and science converge in the quest to understand necessity. A central theme in Spinoza's epistemology is the difference between inadequate and adequate ideas. Imagination gives us images, fragmentary perceptions, and confused representations. These may be useful in daily life but are unreliable guides to truth. Reason gives us adequate ideas, which correspond to the necessary structure of reality. For example, if I see the sun in the sky, my imagination tells me it is a small disk not far from Earth. Reason, however, shows me that the sun is vast and distant. The idea of the sun's true nature is adequate, while the image is inadequate. The power of imagination explains superstition. People imagine God as a person, will, and emotions, projecting their own nature onto the divine. They imagine miracles as suspensions of natural law, because they cannot grasp hidden causes. They imagine freedom as arbitrary choice, because they do not see the chain of necessity. Yet imagination also has constructive power. It enables art, poetry, and symbols that inspire action. Religion, though based on imagination, can motivate moral behavior when it teaches love and justice. The danger arises when imagination is mistaken for truth. Then it becomes superstition, leading to fear, intolerance, and persecution. Reason alone provides freedom. Adequate ideas are not mere images but clear conceptions of necessity. To know that 2 and 3 make 5 is to have an adequate idea. To know that hatred diminishes our power and love increases it is also an adequate idea. The more our mind is filled with adequate ideas, the more we act rather than being acted upon. The highest ideas are intuitive. They do not proceed step by step but grasp the essence of things directly. This intuition is rare but transformative. When the mind perceives the whole of reality as one substance, it experiences joy beyond measure. This is the intellectual love of God. Thus, the journey from imagination to reason to intuition is the path from bondage to freedom, from error to truth, from sadness to blessedness. Spinoza's philosophy is not abstract speculation but a guide to life, a therapy of the soul, a science of liberation. Spinoza's political thought cannot be separated from his metaphysics and ethics. To understand how communities should be organized, one must first understand what humans are: finite modes of the infinite substance, driven by conatus, caught in the sway of passions, yet capable of reason. Politics, therefore, is the natural extension of ethics into collective life. It is the geometry of society. At the root of Spinoza's political philosophy lies his definition of natural right. For Hobbes, natural right is the liberty each individual has to use his power as he wills for self-preservation, leading to a war of all against all. For Spinoza, natural right is even more radical. It is simply the power of each thing to exist and act according to its essence. The right of a stone to fall, the right of a lion to hunt, the right of a man to strive, all are identical. The power each has. In nature, might and right are the same. When individuals form societies, they do not give up their rights in the sense of moral entitlements. They transform their natural power into collective power. The state's right is identical with its actual power to command and enforce. A state that cannot enforce its laws has no real right to do so. Legitimacy, for Spinoza, is not based on divine ordination or abstract contract but on real capacity. This blunt realism distinguishes Spinoza from many political thinkers. He strips politics of moral illusions and grounds it in necessity. Yet he is not cynical. Though power defines right, reason defines the best use of power. A state ruled by fear, oppression, or superstition is unstable because passions are fickle. Only a state that fosters reason and freedom can endure. Spinoza defends democracy as the most rational form of government. In democracy, power is shared among the many, reducing the risk of tyranny. Because humans are equal by nature, all are modes of God, all are driven by conatus, all are capable of reason. Democracy accords with the truth of human existence. Furthermore, democracy best secures freedom of thought, which is the foundation of peace. Freedom of thought is especially crucial. No state can control what people think, for thought is an attribute of God. Attempts to suppress opinion breed hypocrisy, resentment, and rebellion. By contrast, allowing free philosophy strengthens the state, for truth does not threaten order but stabilizes it. Citizens who understand necessity are less prone to superstition and fanaticism. Thus, the security of the state depends on protecting the liberty of the mind. Spinoza's political philosophy is not utopian but realistic. He recognizes that most people are guided by passions rather than reason. Therefore, institutions must be designed to channel passions constructive. Religion, for example, can serve a political role by encouraging obedience and charity, but it must not dominate philosophy. Laws must be clear and just, but rulers must also account for the psychological needs of citizens. Politics is not about creating angels but managing human beings as they are. This realism explains why Spinoza values stability above all. The worst condition is civil war, where power disintegrates into chaos. Better a flawed state that maintains order than a collapse into violence. Yet the best state is one that not only preserves security but also promotes rational freedom. The task of politics, therefore, is to balance necessity, possibility, passions with reason, force with liberty. Spinoza's ideas anticipated many features of modern liberal democracy: constitutional government, secular authority, freedom of expression, equality of citizens, and the separation of philosophy from theology. But unlike later liberals who grounded rights in abstract principles, Spinoza grounded them in the very structure of reality, the power of God or nature manifest in human conatus. His politics is metaphysical realism applied to society. No discussion of Spinoza's philosophy is complete without examining his theological political treatise, published anonymously in 1670. This work was so incendiary that it was immediately banned, denounced as atheistic and blasphemous. Yet it laid the foundation for modern secular thought. In this treatise, Spinoza dissects the nature of scripture, prophecy, miracles, and divine law. His central claim is that theology and philosophy must be kept distinct. Theology concerns obedience, philosophy concerns truth. Scripture aims to inspire piety and justice, not to teach metaphysics. Its authority lies in its moral message, not in its literal details. Spinoza argues that prophets were not philosophers but imaginative men who perceived truths through vivid images suited to their audience. Their aim was practical, miracle to encourage justice, charity, and devotion. Therefore, revelation does not compete reason. The truths of philosophy, that God is nature, that all follows from necessity, that virtue is living according to reason, stand independent of revelation. This distinction undermines the authority of religious institutions. If Scripture does not teach metaphysics, then theologians have no right to dictate philosophical truths. If miracles are impossible, then religion cannot claim authority from them. If obedience is the core of faith, then disputes about doctrine are irrelevant. The state, therefore, must regulate religion to prevent sectarian conflict, but it must also allow freedom of philosophy, for truth cannot be bound by dogma. Spinoza's interpretation of miracles is especially radical. He insists that nothing happens contrary to the order of nature. What people call miracles are simply natural events whose causes are unknown. To attribute them to divine will is superstition. The true miracle is nature itself, the eternal unfolding of God. Equally radical is his interpretation of divine law. For Spinoza, the divine law is not ceremonial commands or arbitrary rules, but the law of reason itself, the command to love God and one's neighbor, which is identical living according to reason. Religious ceremonies may serve political purposes, but they are not essential to salvation. Salvation lies in understanding and in the practice of justice and charity. By stripping religion of supernatural authority, Spinoza makes room for a free, rational society. The theological political treatise thus becomes a manifesto for secular democracy. Its influence can be traced through the Enlightenment to modern liberalism, even if its radical determinism has often been softened by later thinkers. At the heart of Spinoza's critique of religion lies his analysis of superstition. Superstition arises from fear and ignorance. When people do not understand causes, they imagine that events depend on the will of supernatural powers. Droughts, plagues, and victories in war are attributed to divine favor or wrath. Priests exploit this ignorance to maintain authority, offering rituals, prayers, and sacrifices as means to control fortune. Spinoza explains the psychology of superstition with precision. Humans desire security, but the world is uncertain. When good fortune strikes, they thank God. When disaster comes, they blame divine anger. In both cases, they interpret natural necessity as divine will. This cycle keeps them enslaved. Instead of seeking understanding, they cling to rituals and superstitions. The antidote to superstition is knowledge. By understanding natural causes, we free ourselves from fear. By recognizing that everything follows from necessity, we cease to imagine arbitrary divine interventions. By realizing that virtue is identical rational joy, we stop seeking rewards in heaven or fearing punishments in hell. This critique remains relevant. Even today, superstition thrives whenever fear and ignorance dominate. Whether in the form of religious fundamentalism, conspiracy theories, or pseudoscience, the same mechanism operates. Lack of understanding breeds credulity, which is exploited by those seeking power. Spinoza's philosophy provides a permanent remedy by grounding freedom in rational knowledge. Spinoza's philosophy was long condemned as heresy, but over time it shaped the foundations of modernity. The Enlightenment took inspiration from his secularism, naturalism, and defense of freedom of thought. Leibniz corresponded with him, even as he criticized his determinism. Locke, though never explicitly citing Spinoza, echoed his insistence on toleration. Bale defended freedom of conscience by invoking Spinozistic arguments. The German idealists, especially Hegel, saw Spinoza as a necessary starting point. Hegel famously said that to be a philosopher one must first be a Spinozist, for Spinoza revealed the unity of thought and being. The Romantics also admired him. Novalis called him the God-intoxicated man. Goethe declared that reading Spinoza was the greatest turning point in his life. For them, Spinoza's identification of God with nature resonated with their pantheistic vision. In modern philosophy, Spinoza anticipated structural realism, systems theory, and naturalistic ethics. His monism inspired Einstein, who famously said he believed in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists, not in a God who concerns himself the fates and actions of men. In psychology, Spinoza's analysis of the passions foreshadowed modern understandings of emotion, motivation, and cognitive therapy. The idea that emotions can be transformed through understanding anticipates cognitive behavioral techniques. His concept of conatus prefigures drives and self-preservation in biology and psychology. In politics, Spinoza's defense of democracy and freedom of thought laid the groundwork for secular liberalism. His recognition that power is the basis of right influenced realism in political theory, while his insistence on freedom of expression influenced constitutional democracy. Even in contemporary debates about ecology, Spinoza's philosophy resonates. If God is nature, then reverence for the environment is a form of piety. The intellectual love of God becomes ecological awareness. His monism dissolves the separation of man and nature, showing us as modes of a single substance. Thus, Spinoza's influence radiates across philosophy, science, politics, and culture. His once forbidden ideas now form part of the very framework of modern thought. Spinoza is famous for the paradoxical claim that true freedom lies not in escaping necessity but in understanding it. At first glance, this sounds contradictory because we usually think of freedom as the ability to choose otherwise, to break away from determinism, to stand outside the web of causes and assert our independence. But Spinoza saw this bliss as a delusion born from our ignorance of the causes that shape us. When we believe ourselves free in ordinary sense, it is simply because we are aware of our desires but unaware of the chain of external influences that brought them about. For example, a child who craves sweets believes it is freely choosing candy. In reality, that craving is shaped by the body's chemistry, by cultural reinforcement, by habits, by chance encounters with sugar in childhood. If the child were able to trace back all these causes, it would realize that the sense of free choice was only a veil covering necessity. The same is true for adults. A person may think they freely choose a career path, but the choice is influenced by family expectations, by economic conditions, by educational opportunities, by psychological tendencies that themselves arose from past causes. Spinoza insists that once we understand these necessities, we achieve a different kind of freedom. Freedom is not the ability to act without cause but the ability to align our actions with full awareness of causes. A stone falling under gravity is not free because it simply follows external forces. But a human mind, understanding why it feels what it feels and why it chooses what it chooses, becomes freer because its activity arises from adequate knowledge. The closer our understanding comes to the whole of nature, the less we are tossed around by partial emotions, and the more our actions flow from our essence. Think of anger. If someone insults us, we may react with blind fury. This is slavery because our action is determined by external provocation and inadequate ideas. But if we reflect on the causes, the other person's motives, their limitations, our own sensitivities, the universal laws of human behavior, then our response shifts. We are no longer slaves to the passion but become active, responding with understanding. Even if we feel the sting, the knowledge transforms our state. In this sense, freedom is not a metaphysical escape determinism but an ethical and psychological transformation of how we live within it. This idea challenges the modern obsession with free will debates. For Spinoza, arguing whether humans possess libertarian free will misses the point. The question is not whether we could have acted otherwise in some abstract sense, but whether our actions arise from adequate understanding or blind compulsion. True dignity lies in knowing why we act, and in letting reason guide us toward harmony with the necessary order of the universe. When Spinoza writes that the wise man is conscious of himself and of God and of things, he is describing this condition of freedom. Such a person accepts necessity not as a prison but as the structure of reality itself. To rebel against necessity is as foolish as to curse gravity for making us fall. To understand necessity is to transform it into joy. At the pinnacle of Spinoza's philosophy stands the notion of the amor Dei intellectualis, the intellectual love of God. This is not ordinary devotion, not ritual prayer, not emotional worship, but a rational love born from understanding the eternal necessity of the universe. When the mind contemplates the order of nature and sees that everything flows from the infinite substance, it experiences a profound joy. This joy is not fleeting because it arises from adequate ideas, not from partial and transient causes. Unlike pleasures of the senses, which pass away with objects that trigger them, this intellectual joy attaches to what is eternal and infinite. God, or nature, is not a temporary object but the very essence of reality. Therefore, the love that flows from knowledge of God is eternal as well. Spinoza even claims that this intellectual love constitutes the mind's highest blessedness. It is the culmination of our striving, the point at which our conatus, the drive to persist, aligns perfectly with the infinite. In this state, the mind is no longer fragmented by passions but unified by understanding. The individual realizes that its essence is a mode of God's attributes, that it is inseparable from the infinite whole. In this recognition, the mind loves God, and since God is nothing other than the universe itself, the love becomes reflexive. God loves himself through the human mind. The mystical undertones here are unmistakable, though Spinoza arrives at them by the strict path of reason rather than ecstatic vision. For him, salvation is not the promise of an afterlife in heaven but the achievement of this intellectual love in life. Immortality does not mean the personal soul surviving bodily death but the participation of the mind in the eternal aspect of thought. When the mind knows things under the aspect of eternity, it partakes in the infinite intellect of God. This love is not possessive or jealous, not an attachment to a finite object, but an expansive joy that embraces all things. Because to love God intellectually is to love the necessity of all that exists. Nothing is excluded, nothing is cursed. Even suffering, when understood under eternity, becomes part of the infinite order. Thus the intellectual love of God transforms resentment into acceptance, fear into peace, hatred into understanding. Some critics say this reduces love to a cold intellectual exercise. But Spinoza believed the contrary, that reason does not eliminate emotion but refines it into its most stable and powerful form. The joy of understanding the infinite is not less intense than passion but more secure, because it cannot be taken away by fortune. One may lose wealth, friends, or health, but the understanding that everything expresses God remains. In that understanding lies eternal content. This vision resonates with certain strands of Stoicism, with Buddhist detachment, mystical traditions that emphasize union, the absolute. Yet Spinoza's version is distinct because it rests not on renouncing the world but on embracing it as divine. To live well is not to flee necessity but to love it, to love God in the form of eternal laws that structure reality. Spinoza Spinoza radically redefines the concept of virtue. In traditional moral systems, virtue is often conceived as obedience to divine command, conformity to duty, or sacrifice of personal desire in favor of moral law. Spinoza rejects these frameworks. For him, virtue is nothing but power, specifically, the power of a being to persist and flourish according to the laws of its own nature. This means that the virtue of a human is identical to the full expression of its essence. To live virtuously is not to repress desires, but to cultivate adequate understanding so that desires align with reason. A person who acts from reason expresses the true power of their essence. A person enslaved by passions is weakened, buffeted by external causes, and therefore less virtuous. This is why Spinoza insists that the more we strive to live according to reason, the more we are virtuous. Reason strengthens our conatus, because it replaces confused, fragmentary desires with clear, unified action. To see this, consider two individuals, one who constantly pursues wealth out of fear of poverty, and one who understands wealth as only one component of a good life. The first is never satisfied, constantly at the mercy of external fortune. The second is more stable, able to enjoy wealth when it comes but not destroyed when it leaves. The latter lives with greater virtue, because their power of acting is less dependent on external fluctuations. This conception also overturns conventional morality. For Spinoza, good and evil are not objective categories written into the fabric of the universe. They are relative to our conatus. What enhances our power of acting is called good, what diminishes it is called evil. Poison is evil for humans but good for a snake. Excessive fear is evil for reason, but useful for controlling the ignorant in political life. Good and evil are thus relational terms, expressions of how things align with our striving. Virtue, then, is not about self-denial but about empowerment. The more one lives in accordance with reason, the more one flourishes. This is why Spinoza identifies virtue with happiness. For him, there is no opposition between morality and joy. A virtuous life is not a life of renunciation but one of active engaged reality guided by understanding. This stance has enormous consequences for ethics. It dissolves the guilt-ridden frameworks that dominate much of Western moral thought, where virtue often requires suppressing natural desires. Spinoza argues instead for harmonizing desires reason, transforming them into stable joys rather than destructive passions. He does not say, do not desire. He says, desire, but desire wisely. Desire what truly increases your power. The implications for politics are profound as well. A just society is one that maximizes the collective power of its members to live according to reason. Laws are not sacred commands but instruments for empowering individuals to flourish together. Tyranny is evil not because it disobeys divine law, but because it diminishes the power of subjects, enslaving them to fear rather than cultivating their rational capacities. Thus Spinoza's redefinition of virtue creates an ethical vision centered on joy, power, and freedom through understanding. To live virtuously is to live strongly, rationally, and joyfully. Spinoza's philosophy of emotion, what he calls the effects, is one of his most enduring contributions. Long before modern psychology, he provided a systematic analysis of how emotions arise, how they bind us, and how they can be transformed by reason. At the heart of his theory is the idea that effects are modifications of the body that increase or diminish its power of acting, accompanied by corresponding ideas in the mind. Joy is the effect of increased power. Sadness is the effect of diminished power. Love is joy associated with an external cause. Hate is sadness associated with an external cause. Hope is the anticipation of joy. Fear is the anticipation of sadness. By defining emotions in this way, Spinoza reduces them to natural phenomena, subject to the same laws as everything else. This naturalistic approach is revolutionary. Instead of treating emotions as moral failings, he treats them as facts of human nature, to be understood rather than condemned. Just as we study physics to understand the laws of motion, we must study psychology to understand the laws of the effects. Only then can we gain some measure of mastery over. Spinoza distinguishes between passive effects, passions, and active effects. When an emotion arises from external causes we do not understand, we are passive, at the mercy of fortune. When it arises from adequate ideas, we are active, expressing our essence. Thus, fear of death is a passion, because it stems from our ignorance and from the external threat of dissolution. But the joy of understanding nature is an active effect, because it flows from adequate knowledge. This distinction forms the basis of Spinoza's ethical program. The task is not to abolish emotions, an impossible and undesirable goal, but to transform passive emotions into active ones. We do not escape fear by suppressing it, but by understanding the causes that generate it and by cultivating rational joys that replace it. Knowledge liberates by reconfiguring the emotional economy of the soul. Consider jealousy. It torments us because we imagine another person possessing something we desire, which diminishes our own sense of power. If we remain trapped in this imagination, jealousy enslaves us. But if we analyze its cause, the insecurity about our own value, the mistaken belief that another's gain is our loss, then we begin to dissolve its grip. By affirming our own essence and seeking stable joys, we weaken jealousy. Spinoza's analysis anticipates cognitive behavioral therapy, which also aims to replace irrational emotions with more constructive patterns through understanding and reframing. It also anticipates modern neuroscience, which explains emotions emotions as bodily states integrated with mental processes. Spinoza's genius was to see that the path to freedom lies not in denying our embodied emotional nature but in comprehending and redirecting it. The highest active effect is the intellectual love of God, but there are many intermediate steps: rational friendship, joy in shared knowledge, the peace that comes from accepting necessity. Each of these replaces destructive passions with constructive activities. Thus, the cultivation of the effects is the practical core of Spinoza's ethics. Spinoza insists that everything in nature, including human actions, unfolds with absolute necessity. Nothing could be otherwise than it is, because all things follow from the nature of God with the same inevitability as the properties of a triangle follow from its definition. This position is often mistaken for fatalism, but Spinoza carefully distinguishes his view. Fatalism imagines a future already written by fate, independent of our actions. Spinoza's determinism, by contrast, sees our actions themselves as essential links in the chain of necessity. We are not spectators of destiny but expressions of it. This leads to a paradoxical redefinition of freedom. Ordinarily, we think of freedom as the ability to choose among alternatives, to have acted otherwise. For Spinoza, this is an illusion born of ignorance of causes. A stone thrown through the air, if it could think, would imagine itself flying freely when in fact it is determined by the throw. Likewise, when humans act from passions, they imagine themselves free, though they are moved by external causes. True freedom is not the absence of necessity but the understanding of it. When we comprehend the causes of our desires and actions, we cease to be passive. We act from the knowledge of necessity, which coincides with our essence, rather than from blind impulse. This is what Spinoza means when he says that freedom is the intellectual love of necessity. Consider a person addicted to gambling. They feel compelled, unable to stop, yet they also feel as though each time they gamble, they freely choose to play. In reality, they are enslaved by passion. Now imagine that through careful reflection and therapy, this person comes to understand the psychological triggers that drive their addiction, the illusions of chance, the biological rush of dopamine. Armed with this knowledge, they reconfigure their desires, replacing the destructive passion with healthier activities. They still act necessarily, but now the necessity flows from their own essence understood, not from external chains. This is the path to freedom. Spinoza thus dissolves the clash between determinism and freedom. The more we understand necessity, the freer we become. Freedom is not contingency but clarity. This vision anticipates modern science, where recognizing the causal laws of psychology, biology, and society allows us to navigate them more effectively. We do not become less free by understanding our brain chemistry. We become more free because we cease to be surprised or enslaved by it. Spinoza extends his ethical principles into political philosophy. He begins with a realistic anthropology. Humans are not guided by reason alone, but mostly by passions. They are prone to conflict, envy, and fear. Left unchecked, this leads to a war of all against all, where each person's striving clashes destructively with others. To preserve life and enhance collective power, humans form states. For Spinoza, the state is not an alien imposition but a natural extension of the conatus of individuals. Each person transfers part of their right, that is, their power to act as they wish, to the collective in order to secure peace and cooperation. The right of the state is nothing other than its actual power, supported by the unity of the people. This is why Spinoza rejects the idea of absolute, divinely sanctioned monarchy. A tyrant who rules by fear weakens the power of his subjects and therefore weakens the state itself. Durable political order requires empowering citizens, not enslaving. In this sense, democracy is the most natural form of government because it maximizes the alignment between individual striving and collective power. In a democracy, each person sees their conatus reflected in the laws, and so obedience becomes an expression of their essence rather than an alien imposition. Spinoza also defends freedom of thought as essential to political stability. Opinions cannot be suppressed without provoking greater resistance, and attempts at censorship only breed hypocrisy and rebellion. A wise state allows its citizens to think and speak freely, as long as they obey the laws in action. This is not mere tolerance but a recognition of necessity. Minds cannot be compelled, and harmony depends on channeling passions into constructive outlets. Here Spinoza anticipates liberal democracy, centuries before its modern articulation. He saw that the power of a state rests not on divine right or brute force but on the rational cooperation of its citizens. A state that cultivates reason, freedom, and security is stronger than one that rules through fear. Spinoza lived in a time when religion was both politically dominant and intellectually contested. His own community excommunicated for heretical views, and his theological political treatise was banned for centuries. Yet his philosophy of religion is subtle and profound. Spinoza argues that most people cannot live by reason alone. They are moved by imagination, stories, and symbols. Religion provides a framework that channels passions into socially useful forms. Fear of divine punishment and hope of salvation restrain destructive impulses and encourage obedience to the state. In this sense, religion serves a political function. It stabilizes societies by shaping the emotional lives of the masses. But Spinoza is relentless in distinguishing between the kernel of true religion and its corruptions. The essence of religion, he argues, is not ceremonies, dogmas, or mysteries, but justice justice and charity, to love one's neighbor, to act with fairness, to seek peace. This is genuine piety. Everything else is superstition, designed to manipulate people's fears. This is why Spinoza attacks the clergy who claim exclusive authority to interpret God's will. By cloaking politics in theology, they enslave people with superstition. True freedom requires liberating reason from ecclesiastical control. Scripture should be read historically, like any other text, with attention to its human authors and purposes. Its message is moral, not metaphysic, to promote justice and love. Spinoza thus both demystifies and defends religion. He strips away its supernatural pretensions but preserves its ethical heart. Religion, rightly understood, is an imaginative aid to virtue, especially for those who cannot follow reason alone. For philosophers, the highest good is rational understanding. For the masses, stories of divine justice can perform a parallel function. Both paths, however, converge on the same goal: the cultivation of joy, peace, and freedom. This approach shocked contemporaries, but it foreshadowed modern biblical criticism, secular politics, and the sociology of religion. Spinoza laid the groundwork for separating church and state, for recognizing the natural origins of religious belief, and for insisting that the value of religion lies in its ethical impact, not in its claims to supernatural authority. At the center of Spinoza's philosophy lies his theory of knowledge. For him, human minds are finite modes of God, expressing the infinite intellect in limited ways. Yet within these limits, we can ascend through distinct levels of understanding, from confusion to clarity, from bondage to freedom. The first kind of knowledge is imagination. This includes sensory experience, hearsay, memory, and opinion. It is fragmentary and confused because it depends on external encounters without grasping their causes. When a sailor sees waves and imagines a sea monster, or when someone believes in astrology because they heard it from a trusted elder, they operate at this level. Most human life unfolds here, governed by chance impressions and cultural conditioning. The second kind is reason. Here we move from particular images to universal principles. We recognize common notions, such as that all bodies are extended, or that all humans share the same basic emotions. Reason is systematic. It grasps necessity through general laws. Through reason we understand that the planets move in predictable patterns, or that human cooperation enhances power. This level allows us to build science, ethics, and politics. The third kind is intuitive knowledge. This is the rarest and highest form, where the mind perceives individual things as expressions of God's essence. Instead of reasoning through steps, it sees the unity directly, as when a mathematician instantly perceives the solution to a problem, or when one beholds the order of nature and feels at once its necessity and its perfection. This is the knowledge that produces the intellectual love of God. The three kinds of knowledge correspond to three forms of life. Imagination binds us to passions and superstition. Reason frees us from error and enables cooperative living. Intuition transforms life into blessedness, where we see ourselves and all things in God. The path of philosophy is not to abolish imagination, which is natural, but to ascend through it toward reason, and from reason to intuition. This ladder of understanding mirrors the progression of human civilization itself. Societies begin in imagination, governed by myths and rituals. They advance through reason, constructing laws, sciences, and rites. At their peak, they glimpse intuitive unity, harmonizing the particular and the universal. For Spinoza, philosophy is not an abstract discipline, but the destiny of human development, a collective journey toward clarity. Spinoza's most famous and controversial idea is the intellectual love of God. Unlike traditional theologies that portray God as a personal being who loves humans, Spinoza insists that God is beyond passions. God does not love or hate, reward or punish, yet through understanding, we come to love God, and this love is eternal. The intellectual love of God arises from intuitive knowledge. When we see that everything follows from the divine nature, we feel joy. This joy is not directed at a distant deity but at reality itself, which is God. In loving God, we love necessity, order, and truth. Our love is God's love of himself, expressed through us. Thus, when Spinoza says God loves himself with an infinite intellectual love, he means that our knowledge is a finite mode of the infinite self-knowledge of God. This love is eternal because it does not depend on the existence of our body. To the extent that our mind grasps things sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, it participates in eternity. Our finite duration may end, but the truth we grasp remains, and in knowing it, we are part of its eternal expression. Thus Spinoza can claim that the free person thinks of nothing less than death, for the mind, in its highest activity, already partakes in immortality. The intellectual love of God dissolves fear and resentment. We cease to rage against fortune or lament necessity. We see that all things are as they must be, and this vision itself is joy. This is not resignation but empowerment. To love necessity is to harmonize with the universe, to align our striving with the infinite striving of God. In this alignment, our conatus achieves its highest fulfillment. Consider a scientist who discovers a deep law of nature, such as the conservation of energy. At that moment, they glimpse not merely a fact but a structure of necessity, a glimpse into the eternal order of things. The joy they feel is not about utility but about truth itself. Multiply this by all aspects of reality, and one approaches Spinoza's intellectual love of God. This is why Spinoza's ethics culminates not in rules or duties but in a vision. The highest good is not obedience but understanding. The blessed life is contemplative, active, and joyful because it participates in the infinite intellect of God. Spinoza's treatment of death scandalized his contemporaries. Traditional religion promised personal immortality, rewards and punishments after death. Spinoza rejected this, yet he offered a radical alternative. For him, the human mind is the idea of the human body. As long as the body exists, the mind exists. When the body perishes, its particular idea also ceases. There is no personal survive, no memory or identity continuing in another realm. To hope for such is to cling to imagination, not reason. Yet Spinoza also insists that there is an eternal part of the mind. This is not the memory or personality, but the understanding we achieve of eternal truths. When we grasp something through reason or intuition, we do so not as a transient creature but as a mode of God's infinite intellect. This knowledge is eternal, and insofar as our mind participates in it, we too are eternal. This eternal part is not ours in a possessive sense. It does not belong to an ego that persists after death. Rather, it is the perspective from which our individuality was never ultimate in the first place. When we see the world under the aspect of eternity, we realize that our essence is not a passing flame but a ray of the infinite light. Death, then, is not annihilation but a transition, like a wave returning to the ocean. The practical consequence of this view is liberation from the fear of death. If we live in imagination, death is terrifying, the loss of self. If we live in reason, we understand that death is natural, but we still grieve the finitude. If we live in intuition, we see that the eternal part of our mind is untouched, and our joy in God transcends mortality. Thus Spinoza can claim that the wise person thinks of nothing less than death, and his wisdom is a meditation on life. This stance anticipates modern secular philosophies of death. It resonates with the scientific understanding that while individuals perish, the structures of reality endure, and our knowledge participates in those structures. It also echoes Eastern traditions, where enlightenment involves dissolving the ego into the whole. Spinoza's originality lies in showing how this vision follows logically from a rigorous metaphysics of necessity. For Spinoza, virtue is not obedience to rules or conformity to external authority. Virtue is power, the actualization of our essence. To live virtuously is to live according to the guidance of reason, thereby increasing our capacity to act. Traditional ethics often frames virtue as sacrifice, as giving up desires for the sake of higher duties. Spinoza reverses this. Virtue is not against desire but is the perfection of desire. Every being strives to persist in its own being. When our striving is guided by imagination, it leads to conflict, weakness, and servitude to passions. When guided by reason, it leads to harmony, strength, and freedom. Thus virtue is nothing other than the successful expression of our conatus in accordance with truth. Freedom, in Spinoza's sense, does not mean indeterminacy or the absence of necessity. Nothing can exist outside necessity. Freedom means acting from the necessity of our nature, not being determined by external causes that we do not understand. The free person is not someone who could have done otherwise, but someone who acts from the knowledge of why they must act as they do. This conception of freedom is profoundly empowering. It shifts our attention from impossible fantasies of choice to the cultivation of understanding. The more we comprehend ourselves and the world, the more we act from our essence, and the less we are tossed about by external forces. Freedom is self-determination through knowledge. Consider an addict compelled by craving. They feel unfree because they are determined by forces they do not master. Contrast this with a philosopher who understands their emotions, redirects their energies, and acts in harmony with their nature. The philosopher too is determined, but by the internal necessity of reason rather than by external passions. This is the difference between servitude and freedom. Spinoza's idea of virtue also dissolves the dualism between morality and self-interest. To act virtuously is to enhance one's power of being. To enhance one's power is also to increase joy. Thus the good of the individual and the good of others converge, because reason shows that cooperation and mutual aid strengthen all. Virtue is therefore both rational egoism and rational altruism, two aspects of the same striving. This framework anticipates later existentialist and naturalist views that tie ethics to authenticity and power rather than obedience. It also provides a foundation for democratic politics, where freedom is not isolation but shared empowerment. Spinoza's political thought is an extension of his ethics. Just as individuals strive to persist, so too do states. Just as individuals achieve freedom through reason, so too do societies. The foundation of politics is power. Every state exists because individuals, fearing isolation and weakness, combine their powers for mutual preservation. The right of the state is nothing more than its power, its ability to maintain order and defend itself. Laws are effective only insofar as they are backed by the collective power of citizens. This is a sober realism that strips away illusions of divine right or natural hierarchy. Yet power without reason is unstable. A tyrant may command obedience through fear, but fear breeds resentment and rebellion. True stability arises when citizens obey laws not from fear but from rational recognition of their benefit. This is why democracy is the most natural and stable form of government. In democracy, power resides in the people collective and laws express the common interest. Spinoza does not idealize democracy as perfect, but he sees it as the system most aligned intertwined with human nature. Because all individuals are part of God's nature, none has inherent authority over others. Because reason shows that cooperation strengthens all, a government that maximizes participation and consent is most rational. Freedom of thought is central to this vision. A state may regulate actions but not opinions, because opinions cannot truly be controlled, and attempting to suppress them only breeds hypocrisy and resistance. A free state allows citizens to think what they wish and to speak as they believe, as long as they obey the law in practice. This principle, articulated in Spinoza's theological politic treatise, became a cornerstone of modern liberalism. Spinoza also anticipates modern theories of civil society. He emphasizes that religion must not dominate politics, for theological authority leads to tyranny. At the same time, he sees that religion can serve a social function when stripped of superstition. It can teach simple moral obedience to those not inclined to philosophy. Thus, in his system, philosophy and religion coexist, but philosophy retains primacy matters of truth, while religion serves the common good. Ultimately, Spinoza envisions politics as an extension of nature. States, like individuals, are modes of God, striving to persist, guided either by passion or by reason. The best state is one that mirrors the freedom of the wise person, acting not from fear or chance but from the necessity of understanding. Spinoza died in 1677 at the age of 44, his lungs weakened by years of grinding optic lenses. He left behind a handful of works, many unpublished in his lifetime, but their impact would ripple through centuries. His ideas were reviled as atheism, yet they fertilized the ground for modern philosophy, science, and democracy. In metaphysics, Spinoza's monism anticipated later holistic and systemic views of nature. From Schelling and Hegel to Einstein and contemporary physics, thinkers have drawn inspiration from his vision of one infinite substance expressing itself in infinite ways. Einstein, when asked whether he believed in God, replied that he believed in Spinoza's God who reveals himself, orderly harmony of what exists. In ethics, his naturalistic conception of virtue and freedom foreshadowed existentialism, psychoanalysis, and modern psychology. His account of emotions as transitions in power resembles contemporary affect theory and neuroscience. His insistence that freedom lies in understanding necessity resonates with cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness practices that emphasize awareness over illusion. In politics, Spinoza's defense of democracy, freedom of thought, and separation of philosophy from theology influenced the Enlightenment. Locke, Bale, and later Rousseau and Kant built upon foundations he had laid. His ideas would echo in the American and French revolutions, in debates over tolerance, and in the formation of liberal constitutional states. In religion, his pantheism challenged anthropomorphic conceptions of God, paving the way for secular spirituality. Poets such as Goethe and Wordsworth, philosophers such as Novalis and Coleridge, and countless modern seekers found in Spinoza a model of reverence without superstition, devotion without dogma. Yet perhaps his deepest legacy is existential rather than historical. Spinoza shows that joy and freedom are possible within necessity. He dissolves the false hope of transcending nature, only to reveal a higher hope of understanding and loving it. He transforms the fear of death into a meditation on eternity. He turns philosophy into a spiritual exercise, to see the world under the aspect of eternity and to live in the intellectual love of God. In a time when science and religion often seem opposed, when politics oscillates between authoritarianism and chaos, and when individuals feel lost in the flux of passions, Spinoza offers a path of clarity. His message remains radical: that freedom is understanding, that God is nature, and that blessedness is joy in necessity. Freedom, for Spinoza, is one of the most misunderstood concepts in philosophy. Most people equate freedom with free will, the ability to choose indifferently between options, unconstrained by necessity. Spinoza calls this a profound illusion. He insists that everything in nature, including human thought and action, follows from necessity. There is no gap in the causal chain, no moment of absolute indeterminacy. When a stone is thrown and continues its motion, if it had consciousness, it would believe it was freely flying the air. Likewise, humans feel free because they are conscious of their desires but ignorant of their causes. We believe we choose, but in reality our choices are determined by the complex interplay of internal states and external influences. But Spinoza does not conclude that freedom is impossible. Instead, he redefines it. Freedom is not indifference or exemption from causality. Freedom is acting from the necessity of one's own nature, rather than being pushed around by external causes. A free action is one that flows from adequate understanding. This is why Spinoza equates freedom with rationality. The more we understand the causes of our desires, the less we are enslaved by them. To be free is to know why we act, and to align our actions with our essence as thinking beings. For example, someone who lashes out in anger is unfree because their action is determined by an external injury and a confused passion. Someone who responds with calm insight into the causes of conflict is freer because their action flows from rational understanding. In this sense, freedom is not a binary but a continuum. Most of us live somewhere between slavery to passions and full rational self-determination. The task of philosophy is to increase our degree of freedom by increasing understanding. Perfect freedom, acting only from the necessity of reason, is rare, perhaps even unattainable for finite beings. But we can approach it asymptotically. This redefinition has profound profound consequences. It reconciles freedom with determinism. Spinoza can affirm that everything is necessary and yet insist that human liberation is possible. The key is recognizing that freedom lies not in escaping necessity, but in understanding it. As he famously says, freedom is the knowledge of necessity. This perspective also has therapeutic power. Instead of resenting the world for constraining us, we learn to accept necessity. Instead of blaming ourselves for not possessing an impossible free will, we learn to cultivate the kind of freedom actually available. Rational activity. We cease striving for fantasies of absolute control and instead find joy in the real power we possess. Thus Spinoza offers a vision of freedom that is compatible with science, psychology, and political realism. It is not the illusory freedom of the will, but the authentic freedom of understanding. At the summit of Spinoza's philosophy lies the intellectual love of God. This is not worship in the ordinary sense, nor devotion to a personal deity. It is the highest effect, born of the third kind of knowledge, through which the mind perceives its unity with the eternal substance of nature. To love God intellectually is to experience joy in the recognition that one's mind is an eternal mode of infinite thought. It is to see that one's essence is not annihilated by death because it participates in the eternal order of ideas. The body perishes, the imagination fades, but the adequate ideas formed by the intellect are eternal. To perceive this is to rejoice in a love beyond fear and hope. This love is intellectual because it arises from understanding. It is not a passion imposed from without, but an active effect flowing from the mind's own activity. And it is love because it is accompanied by joy, the joy of increased power when the mind grasps its eternal essence. Spinoza describes this love as blessedness, beatitudo, distinguishing it from mere happiness. Happiness depends on external goods, wealth, honor, pleasure. Blessedness depends only on the activity of the intellect, which cannot be taken away by fortune. It is the only stable joy. This love is also universal. Because it arises from understanding, it is not exclusive. To love God intellectually is to love the order of nature as a whole. This dissolves envy, hatred, and pride. It unites us with all beings in a cosmic perspective. The wise person loves others because they see them as expressions of the same divine substance. In this way, the intellectual love of God fulfills the ethical project. It transforms the passions, liberates the mind, and grounds virtue in joy. It is the goal toward which all philosophy tends. It does not eliminate struggle or pain, but it places them within an infinite context where they lose their power to enslave. Politically, the intellectual love of God provides the foundation for tolerance and peace. If we understand that all people act from necessity, we cease to condemn them as evil and instead seek to educate and empower them. If we see each person as an expression of God, we cultivate compassion rather than hatred. The state, then, should not enforce dogma but should protect the freedom to philosophize, so that individuals may approach this highest love in their own way. Thus, Spinoza concludes his ethics not with despair at human limits, but with a vision of eternal joy. We are not separate wills struggling in chaos, but eternal modes of God. To know this is to live blessedly in the intellectual love that cannot be shaken by fortune or death. Spinoza lived in a time when religion dominated every aspect of public and private life. Theological authorities claimed power over kings, communities, and consciences. Dogma was not only believed but enforced. Against this backdrop, Spinoza's philosophy is nothing short of revolutionary. He dared to argue that much of organized religion is not a vehicle for truth but a system of control rooted in superstition. Superstition, for Spinoza, arises from ignorance and fear. When people lack understanding of causes, they become anxious about the future. They project their hopes and fears onto imagined supernatural agents. A storm destroys crops, and the people believe they have angered the gods. A plague spreads, and they think they are cursed. In times of uncertainty, they crave signs, rituals, and promises of protection. Priests exploit this by presenting themselves as mediators between humans and the divine. In his theological political treatise, Spinoza dismantles these illusions. He argues that prophets did not possess supernatural powers but were people with vivid imaginations who expressed moral insights in the language of their culture. Miracles, he insists, are impossible because nature's order is eternal and unbreakable. To believe otherwise is to undermine reason and enslave the mind. The core of religion, according to Spinoza, is not dogma but ethical practice. True piety is not assent to creeds, but justice and charity. The scriptures, he argues, should be read historically as expressions of their time, not as eternal dictates. Once stripped of superstition, religion's true function is to inspire love and moral conduct, not to impose irrational authority. Spinoza's critique of religion is inseparable from his politics. He saw how clerics used fear of damnation to suppress freedom of thought. He saw how rulers invoked divine right to justify tyranny. Against this, he declared that freedom to philosophize is essential for peace and progress. The state should protect this freedom by limiting the power of religious authorities and encouraging open inquiry. This critique remains relevant today. Superstition still thrives wherever ignorance and fear prevail. Political and religious leaders still exploit it to gain control. Spinoza's antidote remains the same: cultivate knowledge, foster rational understanding, and ground ethics in reason rather than revelation. Only then can humanity free from the chains of superstition. Spinoza was not only a metaphysician and ethicist but also also a political thinker. His insights into the nature of power, freedom, and the state remained striking modern. Unlike many philosophers of his time, he did not idealize monarchy or aristocracy. He argued instead for democracy as the most natural and rational form of government. For Spinoza, the foundation of politics is the reality of human nature. People are not angels. They are driven by passions, desires, and interests. A political system that ignores this will collapse. Thus, laws and institutions should not try to eradicate passions but to channel them in ways that promote peace and cooperation. Power, he says, belongs ultimately to the multitude. No ruler can govern without the consent, tacit or explicit, of the people. The sovereign authority arises not from divine right but from collective agreement. A monarchy may appear to rest on one person, but in truth it depends on the obedience of many. Democracy, therefore, is simply the recognition of this fact. The power of the state is the power of the collective, expressed in a system where citizens share in decision-making. Spinoza is careful, however, to avoid idealism. Democracy is not perfect harmony. Conflict will always exist, but democracy is best suited to manage conflict because it gives individuals a stake in the system and reduces resentment. The aim of politics is not to abolish disagreement but to secure peace and freedom amid disagreement. Central to this is freedom of thought and expression. Spinoza argues forcefully that the state should never attempt to control what people think. Belief cannot be coerced. Attempts to do so only breed hypocrisy and rebellion. What the state can demand is obedience in action, not conformity in thought. As long as citizens obey the laws, they should be free to believe and say what they wish. This principle anticipates modern liberal democracy. It grounds freedom of speech not in abstract rights but in practical necessity. Open expression is essential for peace because suppressed ideas only fester and explode. A society that allows diverse opinions is more stable than one that enforces uniformity. Thus, Spinoza unites metaphysics, ethics, and politics into one vision. The same rational understanding that liberates the individual also underpins a free state. Just as the wise individual is free because they act from understanding, the wise state is free because it governs through laws grounded in reason, not superstition. Perhaps the most moving part of Spinoza's philosophy is his treatment of death and eternity. Unlike many religious systems, he does not promise personal immortality. The finite body perishes, and the imagination tied to that body fades. There is no survival of the soul in the conventional sense. Yet he insists that the mind, in a deeper sense, is eternal. This eternity is not temporal duration but timelessness. The adequate ideas formed by the intellect are part of the infinite intellect of God. When the mind grasps things sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, it participates in this eternal order. To understand this requires a shift of perspective. Most people live in time, anxious about future losses and clinging to past memories. They fear death because they imagine it as the loss of their personal self. Spinoza urges us to transcend this perspective. From the standpoint of eternity, nothing is lost because everything that is eternally contained in God. Our essence as modes of thought is preserved in the infinite intellect, even if our personal consciousness dissolves. This does not mean we should despise life. On the contrary, Spinoza insists that the wise person loves life fully, without fear of death. The more we understand, the less we are tormented by anxiety about mortality. Death is not to be feared because what matters most, the eternal truth of our essence, is untouched by it. In this way, Spinoza offers a philosophy of consolation without illusion. He does not comfort us with fantasies of personal survival, but with the deeper joy of unity, the eternal. The intellectual love of God is already eternal because it is grounded in adequate understanding. To live rationally is already to live beyond death. This perspective changes how we act. If we see our lives as part of eternity, we cease striving for transient goods alone. We cultivate what endures: knowledge, virtue, love. We invest not in possessions or honors but in the activity of the mind, and in doing so, we find a joy that cannot be destroyed by time. Thus Spinoza's philosophy ends where it began, with God, or nature, the one infinite substance. From this infinite order we emerge, within it we act, and to it we return. To know this is to be free, to be virtuous, and to be blessed. It is the highest wisdom, the deepest ethics, and the truest politics all at once. At the end of his system, Spinoza situates the human being within eternity. To live well, he insists, is to shift perspective from time to eternity. Most people live absorbed in the temporal, chasing pleasures, fearing losses, grasping after honors, dreading death. Their horizon is narrow, bound to transient goods. But philosophy teaches us to see under the aspect of eternity, sub specie eternitatis. To view things in this eternal perspective is not to deny temporality, but to recognize its place within the infinite. The body ages, fortunes change, death arrives, but the order of nature remains, and our essence, as an idea in God, participates in that order. To grasp this is to detach from slavish attachment to finite things and to anchor joy in what cannot perish. This shift transforms life. The ordinary passions of envy, ambition, and greed lose their grip when viewed against eternity. The person who sees that all things follow from the necessity of God no longer rails against fate. They accept necessity with equanimity. The loss of wealth is no longer devastation but a change in the configuration of modes. The insult of an enemy is no longer a call for vengeance but an expression of their their ignorance. Even death, which terrifies most, becomes less fearsome. It is not annihilation of the eternal essence but merely the dissolution of the body and imagination. Eternity does not mean endless duration. Spinoza insists it is a different kind of being altogether. To exist in eternity is to exist in the eternal order of substance, which is not measured by time. When the mind grasps adequate ideas, it participates in this eternal order now, in the present. Thus, eternity is not something that comes after death, it is accessible in life through knowledge. This realization brings a new way of valuing life. Instead of clinging to transient goods, the wise person enjoys them without dependence. They take pleasure in food, friendship, art, and politics, but they do not bind their essence to them. They see these goods as expressions of the divine order, to be savored but not worshipped. Their true joy lies in understanding, which connects them to eternity. This perspective also deepens ethics. To see others under the aspect of eternity is to see them as necessary expressions of God. We can no longer demonize them as absolutely evil. We may oppose harmful actions, but we do so with understanding, not hatred. Justice becomes a rational arrangement that allows each to flourish according to their nature. Compassion becomes the recognition that others, like ourselves, are finite expressions striving for perseverance. Love becomes the intellectual love of God, extended to all beings. The practical implications are immense. In personal life, this perspective dissolves anxiety. We cease fearing the future because we know it follows from necessity. We cease regretting the past because we know it could not have been otherwise. We live fully in the present, recognizing it as the unfolding of eternity. In political life, this perspective grounds tolerance. The diversity of beliefs is no longer a threat but an inevitable outcome of finite modes grasping reality from different angles. A free state is one that makes space for this diversity, protecting each person's pursuit of truth. Ultimately, the eternal perspective yields blessedness. Spinoza closes the Ethics with the famous line, "All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare." The intellectual love of God is not easy. It requires effort, discipline, and the transformation of one's whole orientation. But it is possible, and in achieving it, the human being finds the highest joy available. Thus, Spinoza's philosophy culminates in a vision both austere and liberating. We are not free wills floating in chaos, but necessary modes of God. Our freedom lies not in escaping necessity but in understanding it. Our salvation lies not in otherworldly rewards but in intellectual joy. Our immortality lies not in temporal persistence but in eternal participation. To know this is to live blessedly, in peace, strength, and joy, illuminated by the light of eternity. When we stand back from the architecture of Spinoza's thought, it is easy to see why it both fascinates and unsettles. His philosophy is not merely a system but a horizon, a way of seeing that continues to ripple outward across centuries. To add one more layer is to recognize that his project is not exhausted by metaphysics, ethics, politics, or psychology. It is also a meditation on the infinite itself and on what it means for finite creatures to orient their lives within infinity. For Spinoza, infinity is not an empty abstraction. It is the very texture of reality. God is infinite in attributes, infinite in modes, infinite in expression. Every finite being is but a ripple on this infinite ocean. To live without philosophy is to mistake the ripple for the whole, to obsess over our small eddies of fortune and misfortune. To live with philosophy is to see the ocean itself, to anchor one's identity not in the passing form but in the eternal ground. This orientation toward infinity brings courage. Ordinary human life is haunted by fear. Fear of death, fear of poverty, fear of rejection, fear of meaninglessness. These fears shrink the soul, but when one grasps that one is part of an infinite order, fear loosens its hold. Death is no longer an abyss but a change of form. Poverty is no longer absolute ruin but one modulation within a larger whole. Even meaninglessness, the great spectre of modernity, dissolves, for meaning is not imposed by will but discovered in necessity. To understand is to find meaning already inscribed in the fabric of things. Infinity also reshapes our understanding of progress. Many philosophies, both ancient and modern, treat progress as a linear ascent, more knowledge, more freedom, more power. Spinoza sees progress different because all things follow from necessity. The universe itself does not progress, it simply is. What progresses is our perspective, from ignorance to knowledge, from bondage to freedom, from fear to joy. Thus progress is not a march toward some external goal but an internal deepening, a greater participation in the eternal. In this sense, philosophy is not a ladder to climb once and then discard, but a continuous practice. To live philosophically is to train the mind to see more adequately, to resist the distortions of imagination, to replace reactive passions with active understanding. It is not achieved once and for all but renewed in each encounter, each relationship, each difficulty. Philosophy is infinite in its work because the finite conditions of human life always tempt us back into narrowness. Spinoza's system is both a map and a discipline, a reminder and a call to action. Infinity also transforms love. The intellectual love of God is not sentimental attachment to a personal deity. It is the joy that arises when the mind recognizes itself as part of the infinite. This love is intellectual because it is rooted in knowledge, and it is universal because it embraces all expressions of the divine. To love God in this sense is to love necessity, to affirm reality as it is. But this affirmation does not erase particular love. loves. On the contrary, it enriches. To love another person sub specie eternitatis is to love them not merely as a bundle of needs and flaws but as a unique expression of infinity. This love is more stable, less vulnerable to disappointment because it is grounded in understanding rather than projection. Finally, infinity provides a model for humility. Human beings often exaggerate their importance, imagining themselves as central in the cosmos. Spinoza's philosophy shatters this illusion. We are tiny, contingent modes, vanishingly small against the infinite order, and yet, this recognition is not crushing but liberating. We matter not because we are central but because we are necessary. Our existence, however small, expresses God's infinite essence. To know this is to feel both humbled and exalted, humbled by our finitude, exalted by our participation in the infinite. Thus, the horizon of Spinoza's philosophy remains open. It does not close with the final proposition of the ethics but extends into every age, every life, every attempt to reconcile the finite with the infinite. To read him is not to finish a book but to be initiated into a way of seeing. It is to stand, however briefly, in the light of eternity and to let that light reshape the contours of ordinary life. The essence of Spinoza's philosophy is not that it delivers a single doctrine to be memorized, but that it initiates a perpetual return to understanding. Unlike systems that claim closure, his invites an endless revisiting because the very structure of reality describes is infinite, and therefore no finite grasp exhausts it. Each encounter with his thought is not repetition but renewal, like seeing the same sea under different lights and discovering new depths in its waves. This eternal return of understanding operates on several levels. On the personal level, the human mind is never free from the temptations of inadequate ideas. Imagination constantly floods us with partial pictures, rumors, fears, hopes, memories, dreams. Even after achieving a moment of clarity, we slide back into confusion. Spinoza's system acknowledges this fragility but also equips us with the means to reorient. By returning to the chain of causes, by tracing our effects to their roots, we can once again rise into clarity. Thus, philosophy is not a fortress we build once, but a path we must continually walk. On the social level, the same applies. Civilizations forget the lessons of reason. They succumb to superstition, charismatic manipulation, political passions. Yet Spinoza's insights into tolerance, freedom of thought, and rational governance remain available to rediscover. Each age must retranslate them into its own idiom, facing its own crises. In the 17th century, his warnings about the dangers of theocracy spoke to Europe's religious wars. In the 21st, they speak to new forms of ideology and polarization. The return is not mechanical repetition but an unfolding spiral. The same truths re-emerge under different circumstances, deepening their resonance. On the metaphysical level, the eternal return is the very rhythm of being. Modes pass away, but substance endures. Forms dissolve, but the essence of God continues to express itself in infinite variation. Human understanding mirrors this rhythm. Each time we grasp an eternal truth, our mind participates in God's infinite intellect. When we lose sight of it, the truth does not vanish, it remains, waiting for us to discover it. The eternal return is therefore not despair at transience but assurance of constancy. The infinite is always there, ready to receive our attention. This framework also redefines what it means to live a meaningful life. If one sought meaning only in permanence, one would despair, for our bodies decay and our particular identities fade. But if one seeks meaning in participation, in aligning one's mind with eternal truths whenever possible, then each act of understanding becomes immortal in its own way. Spinoza writes that the human mind is eternal insofar as it understands things under the aspect of eternity. The eternal return of understanding is the way this eternity manifests in time. Furthermore, this perspective disarms the great anxiety of recurrence. To relive life endlessly, as Nietzsche later speculated, might seem unbearable. One viewed life as a chain of burdens. But for Spinoza, recurrence is not torment because the essence of life is joy when understood right. Each moment of clarity, each recognition of necessity, each joy of understanding is timeless. To return to it endlessly is not punishment but perfection. The eternal return of understanding is not a curse but a gift, the reassurance that truth never dies, that joy is always possible, that clarity waits just beyond confusion. In this way, Spinoza's philosophy closes where it began, with God, or nature, infinite and eternal, the source of all things. But in truth, it does not close at all. It circles back, inviting us once more to live in accordance with necessity, to cultivate adequate ideas, to transmute passions into actions, and to glimpse eternity in the finite. Each reading, each meditation, each act of understanding is another return, another participation in the eternal life of God. Spinoza's philosophy is not a finished edifice but a living practice, and so it continues endlessly, like the infinite it seeks to describe. In the end, Spinoza leaves us with no myths of paradise, no promises of a reward beyond the grave, no threats of eternal punishment. What he offers is both more austere and more profound, the joy that comes from understanding. To live in accordance with reason is not to escape the world but to inhabit it fully. It is to see that every joy, every sorrow, every success, every loss arises from the eternal order of nature. Nothing could have been otherwise, because all unfolds by necessity. Yet within this necessity there is freedom, not the freedom of chance or whim, but the freedom of the mind that understands. The wise person, Spinoza tells us, us, does not mourn or laugh or curse the world, but understands it. In this understanding lies peace. The passions that once enslaved us lose their grip because we see them as natural, as necessary, as part of the infinite web. We no longer rage at fortune, nor tremble at death, for we know that we are modes of God, expressions of eternity, and that the essence of the mind, insofar as it understands things under the aspect of eternity, is itself eternal. This is not immortality in the vulgar sense, not the survival of the ego or the continuation of personal memory. It is deeper, the realization that whenever we think truly, we participate in the infinite intellect of God. That participation is timeless. That joy cannot be taken away. In those moments of clarity, we taste eternity. Thus the end of philosophy is not despair but blessedness. It is the quiet joy of necessity, the serene love of God, the freedom that comes from understanding. To follow Spinoza's path is to learn how to live without illusions, and in doing so, to discover that reality itself, rightly understood, is enough. And so, the circle closes. Substance expresses itself through infinite attributes. Modes arise and pass. The mind strives to persevere, finds itself bound by passions, rises to reason, and at last discovers eternity. The book of nature has no final page, yet each page is complete. To read it rightly is to be free. To love it rightly is to be blessed. This is Spinoza's gift, not a system to memorize, but a way of seeing, a way of returning, again and again, to the eternal that shines within the finite, a way of finding freedom in necessity, joy in understanding, and eternity in every moment.